Have you ever wondered what it's like to sit in on a magazine editorial meeting? Well, this is your chance. You're listening to Salt Lake Speaks, a monthly podcast where our editors, writers, and staff dig deeper into stories, chat with newsmakers, and talk amongst ourselves about arts, culture, food, music, politics, or whatever else might strike our fancy. After all, we are Utah's biggest fans.
Welcome to Salt Lake Speaks, Salt Lake Magazine's own podcast. You can find this and other podcasts at saltlakemagazine.com/podcasts. I'm Ashley Zanter, the Associate Editor of Salt Lake Magazine, here today with Dr. Rebecca Barrett-Fox. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So why don't you go ahead and just let our listeners know a little bit about your research and your background.
Sure. Well, I'm a sociologist, and that's the field I work in, and I'm a professor at Arkansas State University in the sociology department there. And my work is broadly about hate groups and hate more broadly, particularly religious conservatives, and the way that religion and hate overlap, which is a big concern for the U.S. and other countries as well. So internationally, it's a concern. And my first book is on Westboro Baptist Church, which is an anti-gay hate group out of Kansas that a lot of people are familiar with because they travel a lot and do a lot of anti-gay picketing, and particularly since the mid-2000s, picketing at military funerals. And so some folks have unfortunately encountered them there, and I spent years studying that church and spending a lot of travel time with that church and time in the pew there. And that's what introduced me to research on hate groups. And then I continue that work on a number of projects, including currently a project with the National Institute of Justice, and which is a federal organization that studies homegrown white extremism and nationalism. That's what our extremist nationalism and violent extremism, and that's a project that I'm continuing to work on. And my typical experience that I bring to those projects is the focus on religion.
So just to get a baseline going here for our listeners, what is a hate group?
So there's no legal definition of a hate group. Sometimes you'll see petitions circulating online asking for the government to say, Westboro Baptist Church, let's declare it and officially declare it a hate group. There is no legal definition. There is no, in the court of law, no clear definition of what is a hate group. The definition most people work with is provided to us by the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is an anti-hate organization that's been very effective in leading the charge to curtail hate activity and bring to light the behavior and actions of hate groups. And so that definition says that a hate group is a group that disparages or promotes violence against collectives of people, against whole categories of people, based on some kind of characteristic that we often think of about as immutable, like race, nation of origin, religion, disability status, sexuality, things like that. And I think that definition works pretty well to tell us what a hate group is. The harder part of the talking about hate actually is talking about groups, and that's because with the internet, groups no longer have to meet face-to-face to be a group. So historically and traditionally in sociology, we say a group are people who know each other, have some kind of face-to-face interaction, see themselves as related to each other. And with the internet, you don't have to have that anymore. In fact, you can even participate in conversations with people using a pseudonym. You can be a member of a hate group and nobody else knows it because you don't have that barrier of having to show up and show your face as part of it. And so calling something figuring out what is a group is actually harder, I think, now than figuring out what is hate. But generally what we mean is where there's a cluster of activity, people who share some kind of same ideology, pulling in the same direction, making the same kind of argument, relying on the same kind of logic for why a particular group of people should be disparaged.
Okay. So there's been a lot of conversation recently in the news, otherwise internet everywhere, about the recent explosion of hate groups and hate crime. Has there actually been an explosion, or are we just paying more attention to it? Is it just getting
has been an explosion. We saw it in the early, in the 2000s. We saw a similar explosion. The first major online hate hub is a website called Stormfront, and it's not just one of the biggest hate websites on the internet. It's actually one of the biggest websites on the internet, and hate groups were early adopters of all kinds of media, and that's always been true. So if you go back to the 20s with the KKK, that these are groups that have oftentimes been very effective at using AM radio and mass mailing lists and other kinds of technologies, and they got good at it with the internet too. They are very effective online. And when Barack Obama was first elected president, we saw the activity on the Stormfront website just explode. And that was a reflection that told us that there was a lot of latent racism, a lot of people who were very anxious and angry about electing an African American president. And so this current growth of hate groups has been long lasting. It's been a concern for a long time. And so we anticipate whenever there's a major social change, like an advancement in African American rights, in gay rights, or social disruption or a perception of social disruption. So in the 2000s, we saw a lot of hate activity around immigrants, and particularly on the U.S.-Mexico border, a number of hate groups that came up, developed around issues of border patrol and militias down along the border. So those social upheavals are good predictors of a growth in hate groups. Since the election, not just the installation of Donald Trump as president, but during the entire election period, we saw more hate group activity. And a lot of that has been an effort to rebrand hate group activity or hate activity as not extremist, but as reasonable, as rational. So patriotic, and that it's justifiable. And so we've seen for about more than 10 years now, hate group leaders advocating for more of a respectable hate group approach. So, for example, they'd encourage members not to get face tattoos anymore, or not to get tattoos of their group, like in a place where it would be visible. Doesn't mean you never have them. You could still have them in a place where you could signal to somebody else that you're a member of that group, but less visible, and to do more infiltration. So become part of mainstream society so you have more influence there. And then to be kind of respectable, upstanding, and to go to places where you can make, they think they can make inroads, but are respectable places like college campuses. And so that's how we get people like Richard Spencer, who's kind of the face of the alt-right, though a lot of people in the alt-right actually don't like Spencer. They think he's a little arrogant. That's not even the worst of Richard Spencer's character flaws, but he draws too much negative attention. Okay. And so, but that effort to transform what are really hate groups into the alt-right has been deliberate, it's been long-standing, it's strategic, and we can't fall for it. But the alt-right is more pleasant to look at than people in Klan robes, for example, or people with swastikas tattooed on their face. But that doesn't mean it's less dangerous, and in fact, it's more dangerous because it looks more innocent and disguises itself as patriotism.
That makes sense. So I guess there was a tendency in Utah, at least from my experience, to think of Utah as having this like very hegemonic identity. We're all the same. A lot of people look at Utah and they just assume everyone who lives within the borders of Utah is of this cut from the same cloth, so to speak, right? So do we have hate group problems in Utah, or are we sort of exempt from is this an outside problem?
Oh, everybody wishes it were an outside problem. And in fact, when we see hate group activity rise, or when we see hate crime, so this would be a crime that is committed in part, or the target of the crime is committed in part, or chosen in part or in full because of some identity. So if you choose to harm someone in part or in full because of their identity or what you perceive as their identity, that's a hate crime. When hate crimes happen or when hate groups arise, oftentimes our response is to say, but that's not us. That's some outsider, some lone wolf, some
bad apple.
Bad apple, exactly. And that's how we do the reporting of those crimes oftentimes, or those groups oftentimes. We say, hey, not us. And I'm from a small town in Pennsylvania, and in May we had a cross burning about 2 miles outside of the town. It's the closest town where I grew up. It's a rural place, so the town is like 1,400 people, and everything around there is unincorporated. So this cross burning was about 2 miles outside of town on a farm, which is generally how cross burnings occur in rural areas for all kinds of reasons. And so the police officer, we have 1.5 officers in my hometown now, and so one of them is the chief, and the police chief was asked, well, aren't you going to do anything about this? And the fact is, it's not his jurisdiction, it's county jurisdiction, so he really didn't have much to do, couldn't do much about it. But his response was so telling. He said, well, why would I do anything about that? That's not, those people aren't from our town. But I can tell you they're from 2 miles outside of your town, and this town it's the only place with a grocery store, it's the only place with a high school. So these people are in fact part of our town. They just happen to live slightly over the border. And that's very often our response. So we want to say not in Utah. We want to say, no, the people of Utah are good people, we wouldn't do that. And I think for the most part, the people of Utah are good people, and they wouldn't do that. But that doesn't mean that these quote unquote bad apples are not part of Utah culture and that they're not part of our society, because they are. And so yes, we do have these problems in Utah, absolutely. Utah is more homogenous than other states. We're on average whiter than other states. We are on average more religiously homogenous, more religiously similar to each other than people of other states. That is not protective, though, against having hate activity. And so we do have official hate, not official, but Southern Poverty Law Center defined hate groups here. And actually in Utah we have some very active hate organizations. And so American Vanguard is one. It's a white supremacist organization, has branches all over the US. And the Southern Poverty Law Center has defined since 2005 the Fundamentalist Latter-day Saint organization as a hate group based on the church's teaching, the FLDS church's teaching on race, and particularly its teachings about African Americans, which are disparaging and disparage an entire class of people. And so those two are both on the Southern Poverty Law Center's hate map, which is an interactive map where you can go and see all the hate groups that the Southern Poverty Law Center has defined across the U.S. But we also have other kinds of hate movements and hate organizations. One is called Act for America. It has branches all across the U.S., including branches here in Utah, and it's an anti-Muslim organization. A few months ago, it sponsored a number of marches. They call it marches against Sharia law, which are really anti-Muslim marches meant to intimidate and disparage Muslim people. And that disparaging, it's real important to notice, this isn't about political differences. We could have genuine, meaningful differences in the policies that we promote about things like immigration or about gay marriage. But when we say that they're disparaging a group of people, we mean that they're making that argument based on some kind of inherent inferiority about another group of people. And that's very different than saying we have a policy disagreement. If your policy disagreement comes down to some people are subhuman or some people are lesser people, that's when you get to hate. And that's what Act for America does. And unfortunately, it's been very popular in the West. The organization takes credit for the passage of a number of laws that limit they say limit Sharia law, which is really a scare tactic. Sharia law is not a threat in the U.S., but that have prompted hostility towards Muslim people, hostility towards immigrants, and so they've been, unfortunately, measurably effective in promoting anti-Muslim sentiment. That's one. Another one, big one out of Utah, is making an individual who's involved in hate activity has made national waves, is a blogger out of Utah. She's a white woman, and she's LDS, though the LDS Church has removed her details about her from their I am a Mormon website. because she's really at variance with a lot of LDS teaching. She blogs and she tweets under the name Wife with a Purpose, and she's a white nationalist, and she associates her white nationalism with her LDS faith, and she has tens of thousands of followers. I think it's like 22,000 followers now. She's a stay-at-home mother of 6 children and promotes what she calls traditional family and traditional womanhood. So a lot of what she says is misogynistic, it's anti-Muslim, and it's white supremacist. So she is she also makes a lot of homophobic comments, but she really couches it in terms of love of country, love of family, promoting safety for children, and the idea that every culture has a right to protect itself, which on the surface sounds kind of appealing, right? It almost sounds like diversity, right? Like every culture should be respected, but what she means is that America should be for white people, and that's how we respect culture. And so these groups and these individuals like Wife with a Purpose, when they make these arguments, if you just listen to the surface level of them, they can sound appealing. Who doesn't love family? Who doesn't think that we should protect children? Those are good things, but when what you end up saying in your conclusion is that's why we shouldn't allow people from other countries to come to the U.S., that's why we shouldn't allow people of different races to intermarry, that's why people of certain races are inferior to white people, that's when we get hate. She's incredibly popular, and her blog is popular. She's very effective at social media, and she's young. These are not old ideas that that people are bringing with them from childhood or memories of segregation. These are people who are raised in a much more, if not multicultural, because Utah has some elements of multiculturalism, but again isn't tremendously diverse. But these are people who grew up in a culture we think we at least pay lip service to multiculturalism, and they're oftentimes responding to that because they feel threatened, because they sense a loss of power, a loss of white supremacy, and they don't like it, so they're fighting back. And it's hard to say, they don't necessarily want to say I'm a white supremacist, so some of them do and will say that, but if they say I'm fighting for our children, I'm fighting for our country, I'm fighting for our faith, again, that's an appeal to things that are positive.
And we all know what "our" means.
Yes.
In that case, it's all contextual.
Yes, yes. Yeah, and that's easier it is easier in Utah. I think that actually that makes Utah more vulnerable. The homogeny makes us more vulnerable because we assume that we do have a set of shared common experiences, and that's not always true. And when we assume that, we also then make it more uncomfortable for people who don't fit into our stereotype of what a person from Utah is like, and that harms us. So if we look at a place and we say, oh, there's so much homogeny, people are so much alike, there must not be very much hate activity. In fact, it's very much the reverse. Okay. And if you look at patterns of activity across the U.S., a lot of activity happens in places where there's relatively little diversity. So Idaho has a lot of hate activity. Montana has a lot of hate activity. These are not places that are tremendously diverse. And in fact, on the interpersonal level, we know that the more relationships you have with people who are unlike you, the lower your the more resistant you are to hate groups. That's not true in every case, but generally, once we get to know people who are different from us, it's harder to hate them.
Well, and it's funny that you listed Idaho and Montana, because usually when we think about hate groups, we just all immediately think of the South.
Oh.
Like that's a Southern problem. It's not a Western problem.
Oh, no, it's very much a Western problem. And hate groups have targeted the West for strategic reasons. So there's a lot of hate group activity in Oregon. There's demographic reasons for this. There have been long-standing efforts to create a separate white state, whether through...
That's very Handmaid's Tale.
Oh, it is. It is. So there's this effort to create a white ethno-state within the U.S., ideally in the dream world for these groups, going up to a race war and secession of white states. And there are efforts to do this in South Carolina. There are efforts to do this in other parts of the state, but one place that comes up a lot is Oregon because it's very white already. Mm-hmm. So if you were going to pioneer a white state, you'd pick a place where there's already mostly white people.
Got it.
So it's much harder to set up an all-white state in Arkansas or Texas or Louisiana. because there is a higher rate of black people there. And so if you want white supremacy, you go to Idaho, you go to Oregon if you want to set up an eventual white state. And these places are also relatively remote, so there are also places where there's white supremacist training camps. And those happen other places in the US too, but Idaho in particular has seen a lot of activity for people going up, particularly in the 90s, and learning how to do survivalism projects, or learning how to be a white supremacist can happen in those places, sometimes easier than it can in the South. The other part of the U.S. that has a lot of hate group activity is actually Appalachia, which is less racially diverse than the South, but historically has been a place of a lot of hate group activity. We think of the South as having hate group problems, and it absolutely does. The KKK was founded originally in Tennessee, but during its heyday, when the Klan was most popular in the 1920s, as a response to immigration, increasing number of Catholics, increasing number of Jews, increasing rights for African Americans, and African Americans using the rights that they in fact had, the center of Klan activity was in Indiana. That was the headquarters, was Indiana. So that's not the South.
Not Tennessee.
Not Tennessee. And so, yeah, it's tempting to look at other parts of the country and say, not Utah, not the West. The West is about free spirits and independence and people minding their own business.
And you think of California, the biggest blue state on the map.
Absolutely. So. Yeah, and but California has a lot of hate activity.
I believe it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, in an effort to not end this on such a sort of depressing note,
Sure.
right, and to help our listeners out a little bit, what kind of advice would you give to Utahns if they wanted to start combating some of this hate activity in our own state?
Sure. Hate recruiters, when they come to your town, they're seldom going to show up wearing robes. They're going to show up in two ways. They're going to show up making what sound like reasonable arguments about safety and security, and protecting things that we should value. Like I said, family, religion. And so when you hear those appeals, listen with a very critical ear, and push a little bit farther to see if the logic behind those arguments is a hate logic. Again, we can have differences in opinion about policy, we can reach different conclusions about how we should act, but if how you're acting and the policies you're supporting are rooted in hate logic, then you have an obligation to call out the people who are making those arguments, and to find people who are going to solve the problems that you care about, not through hate logic. And sometimes that means taking a hard look at the people you've been voting for, the people you've been listening to on the radio, and making different choices. The other way that hate recruiters will come to town is they'll come in and commit an act of vandalism. So maybe they'll spray paint a swastika on a Jewish synagogue. And if nobody responds, then they know that, or if nobody responds, or if only the Jewish people in the community respond, then they know that the community is fractured, that the community is willing to tolerate a certain amount of hate as long as it doesn't target people in power, as long as it targets people who are a minority. And so if something like that happens, an entire community has to respond swiftly, very clearly, and send a signal that hate is not welcome, and in any form against any person. And when you send that signal to hate group recruiters, they get out of town, they move on. If you let them know that you're willing to put up with a little bit of hate, then they'll come and they'll stay, and they'll find the people who are going to buy that argument. And so on both fronts, kind of the more explicit front, as well as the quieter front, this kind of respectable approach, you just be cautious, use your vote wisely, be thoughtful and critical about what kind of media you're consuming, who are you reading, what websites are you going to, and let the people who are making those arguments know it's not acceptable to you.
Well, there you go. There's your call to action, everybody. So that was Dr. Rebecca Barrett-Fox. She was sitting down talking about her research on hate groups, especially hate groups in Utah. Thank you for sitting down with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so this has been Salt Lake Speaks, Salt Lake Magazine's own podcast. You can find this and other podcasts at saltlakemagazine.com/podcasts.